In a cluttered San Francisco apartment, a 78-year-old woman was about to face her own children's betrayal. What started as a family visit took a shocking turn when they presented guardianship papers. Clara Thompson wasn't your typical elderly homeowner. For 40 years, she had protected her rent-controlled building's vulnerable tenants, known for strategic thinking her family underestimated. When she encountered the legal documents with trembling hands, they had no idea they were walking into her trap. Clara's signature would lead to their complete undoing. What began as an intervention would become their eviction from her life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Clara Thompson's hands trembled as she fumbled with the teacup, deliberately allowing it to rattle against the saucer. The sound echoed through her cluttered living room like a warning bell, though her children seemed to interpret it as confirmation of their worst fears. "Mom, you see?" David's voice carried that particular mix of concern and frustration she'd grown to recognize over the past year. "You can barely hold a cup steady." She let her eyes dart around the room with calculated confusion, taking in the carefully arranged chaos she'd spent the morning perfecting. Bills scattered across the coffee table, some genuinely overdue, others strategically placed duplicates. Maintenance requests from tenants stacked in obvious piles, a half-eaten sandwich on a plate, deliberately left to suggest forgetfulness. "I don't understand why you're both here," Clara said, her voice carrying just the right note of bewilderment. "It's Tuesday, isn't it? Or Wednesday?" Lisa shifted uncomfortably in the worn armchair that had been Harold's favorite spot. Clara noticed how her daughter's trained social worker eyes swept the room, cataloging details. The way Lisa's jaw tightened when she spotted the unpaid Pacific Gas and Electric notice. How her gaze lingered on the stack of tenant complaints about the broken elevator. "It's Thursday, Mom," Lisa said gently. "We came because we're worried about you." Thursday, Clara thought with crystal clarity. October 12th, 2:47 p.m. Elena should be finishing the final paperwork right about now. Worried? Clara blinked rapidly, as if trying to process this information. "But I'm fine. The building is fine. Everything is—" "The building is falling apart," David interrupted, his laptop already open, fingers flying across the keyboard with the efficiency of a man accustomed to solving problems through data and decisive action. "I've been reviewing your finances, Mom. The repair costs alone are bleeding you dry. And these complaints—" He gestured at the scattered papers. "Mrs. Chen in 2B says the heat hasn't worked in 3 weeks. Mr. Park claims there's a leak in his ceiling that you've ignored for months." Clara's performance flickered for just a moment, a flash of steel in her eyes as she thought of Mr. Park, who'd lost his wife last spring and whose fixed income couldn't handle a rent increase anywhere else in the city. Then she caught herself, letting confusion cloud her expression again. "Mr. Park," she murmured. "Yes, he mentioned something. But the repairman said—" Or was it the insurance? "I can't remember who I was supposed to call." Lisa leaned forward, her professional instincts warring with family loyalty. "Mom, David and I have been talking. We think it might be time to consider some additional support. Maybe a nice assisted living facility where you wouldn't have to worry about—" "I don't want to leave." The words came out sharper than Clara intended, a crack in her carefully constructed facade. She quickly softened her voice, adding a quaver. "This is my home, Harold and I. We built something here." David's expression gentled slightly at the mention of his father, but his resolve didn't waver. "Dad would want you to be safe, Mom. He wouldn't want you struggling with things that are too much for you to handle." "Harold would want me to protect our tenants," Clara thought fiercely. "He'd want me to fight for the community we built together, not abandon it to developers who see only profit margins. We've brought someone who can help," David continued, pulling out a manila folder thick with legal documents. "Her name is Janet Morrison. She's a notary, and she's waiting downstairs. We just need you to sign some papers that will give us the legal authority to help you make better decisions about your care and your finances." The moment had arrived. Clara let her hands shake more visibly as she reached for the folder, her mind calculating every detail of what was about to unfold. Through her apartment window, she could see the construction cranes dotting the San Francisco skyline, monuments to the relentless gentrification that had already claimed so many neighborhoods like theirs. "Papers?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. "Guardianship papers," Lisa explained, though Clara caught the slight hesitation in her daughter's voice. Good. Lisa's professional experience was making her uncomfortable with this approach, just as Clara had hoped. "They'll allow David and me to help you manage your finances and make decisions about your living situation." Clara opened the folder with shaking fingers, though her eyes tracked the text with perfect comprehension. The documents were exactly what Elena had prepared her for. Official-looking guardianship petitions that would strip away her legal autonomy and give her children control over her property and her life. Except these weren't the real documents at all. "I don't understand all this legal language," Clara said, letting genuine distress color her voice. Because this part was true, not the confusion, but the distress. That her own children would believe her incompetent, would think her incapable of managing her own affairs, cut deeper than any legal maneuvering. "You don't need to understand it all," David assured her, though something in his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "Just trust us. We're doing this because we love you." Love, Clara thought bitterly. Is this what love looks like when it's wrapped in control and assumptions? She picked up the pen with trembling fingers, pausing dramatically over the signature line. Through the wall, she could hear Rosa Martinez's 6-year-old daughter practicing piano, the same child who would lose her stable home if David succeeded in selling the building to luxury developers. "Will I still be able to stay here?" Clara asked, looking up with wide, vulnerable eyes. David and Lisa exchanged a look. In it, Clara read their entire plan: the assisted living facility, the sale of the building, the displacement of every tenant who'd called this place home for decades. "For now," David said carefully. "But eventually, yes. We think a change might be best for everyone." Clara nodded slowly and signed her name with a careful, elderly scrawl. She added a small flourish at the end, a signal Elena would recognize, when she reviewed the documents, a sign that Phase 1 was complete. "There," she said, setting down the pen with a small, defeated sigh. "I hope you know what you're doing." David's relief was palpable as he gathered the papers. "We do, Mom. You'll see. This is going to make everything so much easier for everyone." Lisa remained quiet, but Clara noticed how her daughter's eyes lingered on her face, searching for something. Clara made sure to look appropriately overwhelmed and grateful, even as her mind was already 3 steps ahead to the call she would make the moment they left. 20 minutes later, after David had retrieved the notary and completed the legal formalities, after Lisa had fussed over making sure Clara had enough groceries and her medications organized, after David had insisted on reviewing her bank statements one more time, they finally departed. Clara stood at her window, watching them walk toward David's sleek Tesla parked on the street below. Her son was already on his phone, no doubt calling his lawyer to begin the next phase of their intervention. Lisa looked back up at the building. Once, her expression troubled. When their car disappeared around the corner, Clara's posture straightened. The tremor disappeared from her hands. Her eyes, no longer clouded with confusion, swept across her apartment with sharp focus. She moved to her phone with purpose, dialing a number she knew by heart. "Elena?" she said when the call connected. They took the bait. Phase 2 starts now. Clara's phone call ended with a satisfied click, the sound echoing through her apartment, like the closing of a trap. The tremor that had plagued her hands mere minutes ago had vanished completely, replaced by the steady precision of someone who had spent months preparing for this exact moment. She moved through her apartment with purpose now, gathering the scattered bills and complaints into neat piles. The chaos that had so convinced David and Lisa of her incompetence was merely stage dressing, every piece carefully placed to support the narrative they expected to see. The overdue PG&E notice? A duplicate? The tenant complaints? Strategic misdirection. Even the half-eaten sandwich had been a calculated detail. 20 minutes later, Clara sat across from Elena Vasquez in the corner booth of Café Luna, a small establishment 3 blocks from her building where the owner, Mrs. Chen, served the strongest coffee in the Mission District and asked no questions about the quiet conversations that took place in her back corner. "They actually believed you were signing guardianship papers?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she reviewed the documents Clara had brought. At 34, Elena carried herself with the focused intensity of someone who had learned early that the law could be either a weapon or a shield, depending on who wielded it. "David was so confident in his plan, he barely looked at what I was actually signing," Clara replied, allowing herself a small smile. Lisa had more doubts, but she deferred to her brother's certainty. Elena spread the papers across the worn wooden table, her trained eyes scanning the legal language with satisfaction. "The Tenant Protection Trust is now officially established. As of 2:47 p.m. today, every unit in your building is protected under irrevocable tenancy agreements. Even if David somehow gained control of the property, he couldn't evict a single tenant without cause that would stand up in housing court." Clara nodded, though her expression remained serious. "And the financial protection?" "All covered. The trust structure means that any attempt to sell the building would require unanimous tenant consent, which they'll never give. Your children think they're about to inherit a valuable piece of San Francisco real estate. What they'll actually inherit is a building they can't sell, can't convert, and can't empty." The irony wasn't lost on Clara. Her children had come to protect her from what they saw as financial vulnerability, never realizing that their intervention had just triggered the most sophisticated legal protection her tenants could ever have hoped for. Elena leaned back in her chair, her expression mixing admiration with concern. "Clara, what you've done here is brilliant. But your children aren't going to simply accept this when they find out. David strikes me as the type who doubles down when he feels challenged." "I know my son," Clara said quietly, "which is why we need to move quickly to the next phase." After their meeting, Clara walked the familiar route back to her building. But instead of going directly to her apartment, she made several stops. First to Mr. Park in 3A, where she found him as she expected, sitting by his window, watching the street with the patient observation of someone who had learned to find entertainment in the rhythm of his neighborhood. "Clara," he said, rising from his chair with the careful movement of someone whose joints had earned their stiffness through decades of hard work. "How did it go?" Park Joon-ho had moved into the building in 1984 when his wife was still alive and the neighborhood was filled with other Korean War veterans who understood the particular weight of displacement. His rent-controlled apartment was what allowed him to survive on Social Security in a city where a studio apartment now cost more than most people made in a month. "Phase 1 is complete," Clara said, settling into the chair across from him. "The Protection Trust is established. Your home is safe." She watched the tension leave his shoulders, a burden he'd been carrying since David's first visit to the building 6 months ago, when her son had made it clear that he viewed the tenants as obstacles to be removed rather than neighbors to be respected. "And the cost?" Park asked. "This Elena Vasquez. Lawyers aren't cheap." Clara smiled. Elena grew up in a building like this one in the Castro. Watched her grandmother get evicted when she was 12 because a developer wanted to flip the units into condos. She's not doing this for the money. From Park's apartment, Clara made her way to 1B, where Rosa Martinez was helping her 6-year-old daughter Carmen with homework at their small kitchen table. Rosa looked up when Clara knocked, and the relief in her eyes was immediate and profound. "Mrs. Thompson," Rosa said, opening the door wide. "Come in, please. Carmen, say hello to Mrs. Thompson." "Hi, Grandma Clara," Carmen chirped, using the name all the children in the building had adopted for Clara. "I'm practicing my multiplication tables. Want to hear?" "Maybe later, sweetheart," Clara said gently. "I need to talk to your mama first." Rosa poured coffee from a pot that had been brewing since morning, strong, dark, and perfectly suited to the conversation they needed to have. At 29, Rosa Martinez had already lived through more upheaval than most people faced in a lifetime. An abusive marriage that had ended with her fleeing in the middle of the night with Carmen and 2 suitcases. A series of temporary housing situations that had taught her the constant anxiety of never knowing how long she could stay anywhere. Finding Clara's building 3 years ago had been the first time since Carmen's birth that Rosa had felt truly secure. The below-market rent allowed her to attend nursing school while raising her daughter. The community of tenants had become the extended family neither she nor Carmen had ever known. "The papers your son wanted you to sign," Rosa said carefully. "Are we safe?" "You're safe," Clara confirmed. "Not just for now, permanently. The legal structure we've put in place means that even if something happens to me, your tenancy is protected." Rosa's hand trembled slightly as she set down her coffee cup. "I don't know how to thank you. When Carmen and I first came here, after everything that happened with her father, this place saved us. This building has always been about community," Clara said. "Harold and I, we didn't buy this place to get rich. We bought it to create something lasting, somewhere people could build lives without fear." She thought of her late husband, who had worked 2 jobs for 15 years to help pay off the building's mortgage. Harold Thompson had been a man who measured wealth not in property values but in the stability he could provide for others. He would have been proud of what Clara was doing, even if it meant standing against their own children. "What happens next?" Rosa asked. "That depends on David," Clara admitted. "When he realizes what's really happened, he's going to fight back. Hard. We need to be prepared for that." Clara's final stop was unexpected. She knocked on the door of apartment 2C, home to the building's newest tenant, Marcus Webb. A veteran himself, though from a more recent conflict, Marcus had moved in just 8 months ago. Unlike the other tenants, he paid market-rate rent, which helped subsidize the building's operations, while the rent-controlled units remained affordable. "Mrs. Thompson," Marcus said, opening the door with obvious surprise. At 35, he carried himself with the controlled awareness of someone who had learned to assess threats quickly and respond accordingly. "Is everything okay?" "I wanted you to know what's happening," Clara said. "Since you're part of this community now, you deserve to understand what we might be facing." She explained the situation, her children's intervention, the legal protection she'd established, and the likelihood that David would escalate his efforts once he discovered the truth. Marcus listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious as she spoke. "Your son sounds like the type who's used to getting his way," Marcus observed. "He is. And he has resources, money, connections, legal representation. When he realizes I've outmaneuvered him, he's going to come at this building with everything he has." Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering. "What kind of support do you need?" The question surprised Clara. She had expected Marcus to be concerned about being drawn into a family conflict, not offering to help resolve it. "I'm not asking you to get involved in my family problems," she said. "With respect, Mrs. Thompson, this stopped being just your family problem the moment it threatened the community you've built here. These people, Mr. Park, Rosa, and Carmen, the others, they're good neighbors. If someone's trying to destroy their homes to make a profit, that's not something I can ignore." Walking back to her own apartment, Clara felt the weight of what she'd set in motion. The legal protection was in place, but Elena was right. David wouldn't accept defeat quietly. Her son had built his career on solving problems through determination and superior resources. When he discovered that his elderly, confused mother had just outflanked him completely, his response would be swift and potentially devastating. But as Clara climbed the stairs to her third-floor apartment, she also felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. For too long, she had watched her neighborhood change around her, watched longtime residents displaced by forces that seemed unstoppable. Tonight, for the first time, she had struck back. Her phone was ringing when she entered her apartment. David's name appeared on the caller ID, and Clara felt her heart rate spike. Was it possible he had already discovered something? She let it ring 4 times before answering, making sure her voice carried the appropriate confusion and frailty. "Hello? Mom, it's David. I just wanted to check on you after today. Make sure you're feeling okay about everything." "I think so," Clara said carefully. "Though I'm still not entirely sure what I signed. It was all so overwhelming." "You don't need to worry about the details. Lisa and I are going to handle everything from here. In fact, I'm going to arrange for someone to come help you organize your bills and paperwork tomorrow. Get everything straightened out." Clara's grip tightened on the phone. David was moving faster than she had anticipated. "That's very thoughtful, dear, but I can manage." "Mom, you signed those papers because you trust us to help you, right? Well, this is us helping. I've already made the appointment." After the call ended, Clara immediately dialed Elena's number. "He's sending someone tomorrow," she said without preamble. "Probably an accountant or financial advisor who'll dig into everything. How long before they realize what we've done?" "If they're thorough, a few days at most. The trust structure is sophisticated, but it's not invisible." Clara looked out her window at the neighborhood she had called home for 4 decades. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, her tenants were sleeping safely in homes that could no longer be taken from them. It was a start. The financial advisor arrived at 9 a.m. sharp, briefcase in hand and questions already forming on his lips. Clara had been awake since dawn, preparing for this moment, the first real test of whether her carefully constructed performance could withstand professional scrutiny. "Mrs. Thompson? I'm Robert Hartley from Palo Alto Financial Services. Your son David asked me to help you organize your affairs." Clara opened the door with calculated hesitation, allowing confusion to cloud her features. "Oh, yes, David. Mentioned something. Please come in." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But even as she played her role, Clara was cataloging details about Hartley. The expensive watch, the way his eyes immediately swept her apartment, assessing value. This wasn't just a financial advisor. This was someone David had chosen specifically to build a case for her incompetency. For 2 hours, Clara maintained her performance while Hartley reviewed her bank statements, property records, and correspondence. She answered his questions with just the right mix of clarity and confusion, providing information that seemed helpful while carefully avoiding anything that might reveal the full scope of her recent activities. "I see you've had several meetings with Elena Vasquez," Hartley noted, his tone carefully neutral. "Can you tell me about those?" Clara's heart raced, but her voice remained steady. "Elena? Oh yes, she's a lovely young woman. She helped me with some paperwork, I think. There was something about the building, but I'm afraid I don't remember the details." It was a dangerous moment. Too much confusion, and Hartley would become suspicious. Too much clarity, and he'd realize she was more competent than David believed. Hartley made several notes before closing his folder. "I'll need to review these documents with Mr. Thompson. We may have some follow-up questions." The moment the door closed behind him, Clara dropped her act and reached for her phone. But before she could call Elena, heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside her apartment. David's voice, sharp with frustration, carried through the thin walls. "Mom, open up. We need to talk. Now." Clara barely had time to resume her confused, elderly woman posture before David burst through her door, his usually composed demeanor cracked with barely contained anger. "Robert just called me," David said, not bothering with pleasantries. "He says you've been meeting regularly with a tenant rights lawyer. Care to explain why my confused, overwhelmed mother has been having secret meetings with attorneys?" Clara blinked slowly, as if processing this information. "I told you, Elena is very nice. She just wanted to help." "Help with what, exactly?" David's voice was rising now, and Clara recognized the tone from his childhood, the frustrated demand for answers when he suspected someone was keeping secrets from him. "Because, according to Robert, there are some very interesting discrepancies in your financial records. Payments to legal services, property transfers, things that don't match up with a woman who can't remember what day it is. I don't understand." "Why you're shouting at me?" Clara said, allowing hurt to creep into her voice. "I thought you wanted me to get help managing things." "Not from a lawyer who specializes in fighting evictions," David snapped. "Do you have any idea what you might have signed? What this Elena person might have convinced you to do?" It was then that Lisa arrived, her key turning in the lock, just as David's voice reached its peak volume. Clara watched, her daughter taking the scene, David looming over Clara's chair, his face flushed with anger, Clara herself appearing small and overwhelmed in the face of his fury. "David, what is going on?" Lisa's professional training immediately kicked in, her voice carrying the authoritative calm she used with agitated clients. "Why are you yelling at Mom?" "I'm not yelling," David began, then caught himself as he realized how he looked. "Lisa, she's been lying to us. She's been meeting with lawyers behind our backs." Lisa moved between her brother and their mother, her body language protective. Even if that's true, screaming at her isn't going to help anyone understand what happened. Clara seized the moment, allowing tears to well in her eyes. "I wasn't trying to lie. Elena said she was helping me understand my options. I thought that's what you wanted me to do. Get help." "What kind of help?" Lisa asked gently, kneeling beside Clara's chair. "Can you tell us what you discussed with Elena?" It was a crucial moment. Lisa's professional experience was making her approach this as an elder care issue rather than a family conflict. Clara could see the assessment happening. Was this a case of an elderly person being taken advantage of by an unscrupulous lawyer, or was there something else going on? "She talked about protecting the building," Clara said carefully, "making sure the tenants wouldn't lose their homes. She said there were ways to keep families from being displaced." David's expression darkened. "Mom, those tenants are exactly the problem. They're paying below-market rent that doesn't cover the building's maintenance costs. The smart thing would be to renovate and lease at market rate." "But where would they go?" Clara asked, and for a moment, her genuine emotion broke through the performance. "Mr. Park has lived here for 40 years. Rosa and her little girl have nowhere else they could afford." "That's not your responsibility," David said, firmly. "Your responsibility is to yourself, to your own financial security." Lisa was watching this exchange carefully, and Clara could see professional alarm in her daughter's eyes. "David, you're talking about displacing vulnerable people. Mom's tenants include an elderly veteran and a single mother. That's not just a financial decision, it's a moral one." "This isn't about morals, Lisa. It's about Mom's competency. She's being manipulated by people who want to use her property for their own benefit. Or maybe," Lisa said quietly, "she's making decisions based on values you don't share." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Clara watched her children face each other across an ideological divide she had inadvertently created. David's corporate mindset, which reduced every problem to profit margins and efficiency metrics. clashing with Lisa's social work background, which prioritized human welfare over financial optimization. "Since when do you side with Mom over me?" David demanded. "Since you started treating her like she's incompetent instead of like she's making choices you disagree with," Lisa shot back. Clara remained silent, recognizing that anything she said now might disrupt the natural evolution of this conflict. Her children needed to confront their own assumptions about her capabilities and her right to make decisions about her own property. David pulled out his phone, his jaw set with determination. "Fine. If you both want to pretend this is about Mom's autonomy instead of her declining mental state, then we'll let the professionals decide. I'm calling Adult Protective Services." "David, no," Lisa protested. "That's not necessary." "It absolutely is necessary. If Mom is competent enough to make complex legal decisions about her property, then she should be able to pass a professional competency evaluation. And if she can't—" He left the threat unfinished. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. An APS investigation would be far more thorough than anything David could arrange privately. Professional investigators who specialized in elder abuse and exploitation. People trained to see through performances and recognize manipulation. But as David made his call, requesting an emergency evaluation, Clara also saw opportunity. If she could convince APS that she was competent and acting of her own free will, it would validate everything she'd done while simultaneously establishing David as the problem rather than the solution. The game had just become much more dangerous. But it had also become much more winnable. "They'll send someone tomorrow," David announced, ending his call. "We'll see exactly how competent Mom really is." As her children prepared to leave, David still angry, Lisa increasingly troubled by her brother's behavior, Clara made a decision that would change everything. "Lisa," she said quietly, "could you stay for a few minutes? There's something I need to tell you." After David stormed out, Clara found herself alone with Lisa for the first time in months. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions and the weight of David's threat hanging in the air like smoke from a distant fire. "What did you want to tell me?" Lisa asked, settling back into Harold's old chair with the careful posture of someone preparing for difficult news. Clara studied her daughter's face, the slight lines around her eyes that spoke of years spent listening to other people's problems, the set of her jaw that suggested professional skepticism, warring with family loyalty. This was the moment of greatest risk. Once she revealed the truth to Lisa, there would be no going back. "Your brother isn't wrong about the lawyer," Clara said carefully. "I have been meeting with Elena Vasquez." Lisa's expression didn't change, but Clara caught the slight shift in her posture. "Go on." "But David is wrong about why." Clara took a breath, letting some of her real sharpness show through. "I'm not being manipulated, Lisa. I'm not confused about what I'm doing. I sought Elena out 6 months ago when David first started, talking about helping me manage my affairs." The words hung between them. Clara watched her daughter process this information, saw the exact moment when Lisa's professional training clicked into place. "You've been pretending," Lisa said. It wasn't a question. "I've been protecting myself and my tenants." Clara's voice carried none of the confusion or frailty she'd displayed for David. "Your brother sees this building as an investment opportunity. I see it as home for 9 families who have nowhere else to go." Before Lisa could respond, the buzzer echoed through the apartment. Clara's stomach tightened. Adult Protective Services worked fast when a family member called with concerns about elder abuse or exploitation. Detective Maria Santos stood in the hallway, her badge visible, but her demeanor more social worker than law enforcement. At 42, she carried herself with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned that family dynamics were rarely what they appeared on the surface. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm Detective Santos with Adult Protective Services. I understand there are some concerns about your living situation and decision-making capacity." Clara felt Lisa's eyes on her as she responded. Please, come in. Though I'm not sure what concerns you're referring to. Santos entered the apartment with the practiced observation skills of someone who could read a living situation in 30 seconds. Clara watched her catalog the details, the organized medication dispenser on the kitchen counter, the clean apartment, the coherent arrangement of furniture and personal items. Your son David called our office yesterday, Santos explained, settling into the chair Clara offered. He expressed concerns that you might be vulnerable to financial exploitation by outside parties. Specifically, he mentioned meetings with an attorney that he feels might not be in your best interests. I see. Clara's response was carefully neutral. Too much defensiveness would seem suspicious. Too little would suggest she didn't understand the implications. Can you tell me about your relationship with Elena Vasquez? This was the test. Santos was trained to spot elder abuse, but she was also trained to recognize family members who used the system to control elderly relatives. Clara's answer would determine which category this investigation fell into. Elena has been helping me understand my legal options regarding my property, Clara said. I own this building, Detective Santos. I have 9 tenant families who depend on affordable housing. When my children started discussing putting me in assisted living and selling the building, I wanted to understand what rights I had. Santos made notes, but her expression remained neutral. And what did Ms. Vasquez advise you to do? She helped me establish a tenant protection trust. It ensures that even if something happens to me, my tenants can't be displaced for profit. Lisa shifted in her chair, and Clara could feel her daughter's growing understanding of the situation's complexity. Were you pressured into creating this trust? Santos asked. Quite the opposite. I approached Elena after researching tenant rights law myself. The trust was my idea. It was then that Carmen Martinez's voice echoed from the hallway outside, the 6-year-old practicing her multiplication tables as she walked home from school with her mother. 7 times 8 is 56. 8 times 8 is 64. Santos heard the child's voice, and something shifted in her expression. How many families live in this building? 9, Clara replied, including 3 children under the age of 10. And your son wants to sell the building? He believes it would be financially beneficial for me to move to assisted living and convert the units to market-rate rentals. Clara kept her voice steady, factual. He's probably right about the financial benefits. Market-rate units would generate significantly more income. But you chose a different path. I chose to honor the community my late husband and I built. Here. These aren't just tenants, Detective Santos. They're neighbors who've become family. As if summoned by Clara's words, a gentle knock came at the door. Mr. Park's voice called through the wood. Clara, I brought the chess set you wanted to borrow. Clara excused herself to answer the door, and Santos watched the interaction carefully. Park's immediate concern when he saw the official visitor, Clara's quiet reassurance, the obvious affection between them, it painted a picture of community rather than exploitation. Mr. Park, Santos said, introducing herself. I'm conducting a routine check on Mrs. Thompson's well-being. How long have you known her? 40 years, Park replied without hesitation. Clara and Harold, they saved my life when I moved here. Fixed rent, good neighbors, safe place for my wife before she passed. Clara's been taking care of all of us ever since Harold died. And recently, have you noticed any changes in her behavior or decision-making? Park's weathered face creased into something approaching a smile. Only that she's gotten smarter about protecting what matters. That trust she set up? Best thing that's happened to this building in years. After Park left, Santos continued her evaluation. She reviewed Clara's medical records, examined her financial statements, tested her cognitive function with standard assessment tools. Clara answered every question clearly and accurately, demonstrating not just competency, but strategic thinking. Mrs. Thompson, Santos said finally, Your son painted a picture of someone who might be vulnerable to manipulation. What I'm seeing is someone who identified a threat to her community and took sophisticated legal action to address it. David sees confusion where there's actually disagreement, Lisa said quietly. It was the first time she'd spoken since Santos arrived, and her words carried the weight of professional assessment. I work with elderly clients. Mom's not showing signs of cognitive decline. She's showing signs of being underestimated by her family. Santos closed her notebook. Her evaluation? Complete. I'll need to interview your son David as part of this investigation, and I'll want to speak with Ms. Vasquez to understand the legal arrangements you've made. But preliminarily, Mrs. Thompson, I see no evidence of exploitation or diminished capacity. After Santos left, Clara and Lisa sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Lisa spoke. How long have you been planning this? 6 months, Clara admitted. Ever since David first mentioned helping me manage my affairs. And the confused old lady act? Seemed like the best way to let him believe he was in control while I actually maintained it. Lisa was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. David's going to be furious when he finds out. I know, Clara's voice carried genuine sadness. I never wanted it to come to this with my own son, but I couldn't let him destroy what Harold and I spent 40 years building. Lisa stood up, gathering her purse with the decisive movement of someone who had just made an important decision. Mom, there's something you should know. David's already contacted a lawyer about emergency guardianship proceedings. If the APS investigation doesn't go the way he wants, he's prepared to fight this in court. Clara felt her heart sink. An emergency guardianship hearing would be far more dangerous than an APS investigation. It would mean David was moving beyond trying to help her and into trying to control her by force. Thank you for warning me, Clara said. There's more. Lisa's expression was troubled but determined. When David finds out what Santos concluded, today he's going to escalate this. Hard. You need to be prepared for that. As Lisa left, Clara realized that the real battle was just beginning. The APS investigation had validated her competency, but it had also confirmed for David that his mother was far more capable and far more defiant than he had ever imagined. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, Clara had gained something unexpected. An ally within her own family who finally understood that the choice wasn't between care and neglect, but between respect and control. Kevin Thompson's motorcycle announced his arrival 3 blocks away, the familiar rumble of his vintage Honda echoing off the narrow Mission District streets. Clara heard it from her kitchen window and felt her first genuine smile in days. Of all her children, Kevin was the only one who truly saw her, not as a problem to be solved or a burden to be managed, but as a person whose thoughts and feelings mattered. At 25, Kevin carried himself with the confident idealism of someone who still believed the world could be changed through art and activism. His graduate work at SF State focused on documenting gentrification's impact on working-class communities, making him uniquely positioned to understand what was really happening in his mother's building. Clara was waiting in the lobby when Kevin burst through the front door, his messenger bag slung across his shoulder, and his dark hair tousled from the helmet he'd just removed. But instead of his usual easy smile, his face carried confusion and concern. Mom, what the hell is going on? David left me 3 voicemails talking about lawyers and adult protective services and you being manipulated by tenant activists. He sounded completely unhinged. Clara felt the familiar tension of choosing how much truth to reveal. With Lisa, she'd been cautious, revealing just enough to gain an ally. With Kevin, she sensed she could risk more honesty. Come upstairs, she said. We need to talk. In her apartment, Kevin's trained eye immediately picked up details his siblings had missed. The careful organization of legal documents on her desk. the absence of any genuine confusion about her surroundings. The sharp intelligence in her eyes that she'd hidden so carefully from David and Lisa. "You're not confused at all, are you?" Kevin said, settling into Harold's chair with the easy familiarity of someone who'd been visiting regularly for years. "Not even slightly," Clara confirmed, abandoning any pretense of frailty. "Though your brother and sister needed to believe I was." Kevin leaned forward, his expression mixing admiration with concern. "Mom, tell me you haven't been running some kind of elaborate con on your own family. I've been protecting this building and everyone in it from your brother's idea of helping." Clara's voice carried steel now, the authority of someone who'd spent 40 years managing property and tenants. "David decided I was incompetent and needed to be managed. I decided to let him believe that while I put legal protections in place." "Legal protections?" Clara explained the Tenant Protection Trust, Elena's involvement, and the APS investigation that had validated her competency. Kevin listened without interruption, his filmmaker's mind clearly cataloging the story's dramatic elements. "This is incredible," he said finally. "David tried to manipulate you into signing away your autonomy, so you manipulated him into signing away his inheritance rights instead." "It's more complex than that," Clara said carefully. "I don't want to hurt my children, but I couldn't let David destroy what your father and I built here." Kevin stood up, pacing to the window that overlooked the building's small courtyard, where Carmen Martinez was playing with 2 other children from the building. "Does he know yet? About the trust?" "Not the details, but he suspects something. Lisa warned me he's preparing emergency guardianship proceedings." Kevin's expression darkened. "He's going to court to have you declared incompetent?" "If the APS investigation doesn't give him the results he wants, yes." "Mom, you realize what this means? David's not just trying to help you anymore. He's trying to take control of your life by force." The weight of Kevin's words settled between them. Clara had been so focused on protecting her tenants that she hadn't fully grasped how far David was willing to go to get his way. "I need to see these documents," Kevin said. "The trust papers, the guardianship petition, all of it." For the next hour, Kevin reviewed everything with the thoroughness of someone whose academic work had taught him to analyze complex legal and social situations. His questions were sharp and informed, revealing an understanding of housing law that surprised even Clara. "This Elena Vasquez, she's brilliant," Kevin said finally. "The trust structure is airtight. Even if David somehow gained guardianship, he couldn't break these tenant protections without years of litigation." "But?" Kevin's expression was troubled. "But David doesn't know that yet. And when he finds out, he's going to feel completely betrayed. Not just outsmarted. Betrayed. By his own mother." Clara felt the familiar weight of guilt she'd been carrying since this began. "I know. More importantly, he's going to realize that you've been playing him from the beginning. That every moment of confusion, every sign of frailty, was a performance designed to make him underestimate you." "What choice did I have? He'd already decided I was incompetent. Nothing I said was going to change his mind." Kevin was quiet for several minutes, staring out at the street where David's Tesla had been parked during yesterday's confrontation. "Mom, I think you're underestimating how dangerous this situation is about to become." "What do you mean?" "David's built his entire career on being the smartest person in the room, on solving problems that other people can't solve. When he realizes that his confused elderly mother has just outmaneuvered him completely, it's going to destroy his sense of himself." Clara hadn't considered this angle. She'd been focused on the legal and practical aspects of protecting her building, not on the psychological impact her deception would have on David's identity. "He's going to come at this with everything he has," Kevin continued. "Not just money and lawyers, but real fury. The kind of anger that comes from someone who feels like they've been made a fool of." "So what do you think I should do?" Kevin turned back to face her, his expression serious but determined. Fight back, but not alone. He pulled out his phone. I'm calling Lisa. She needs to understand what's really happening here before. David escalates this further. Kevin, I don't want to put you in the middle of this family conflict. Mom, I'm not in the middle of it. I'm on your side. What David's doing isn't family loyalty. It's control disguised as care. And what you're doing isn't defiance. It's self-defense. As Kevin made his call to Lisa, Clara realized that her youngest son had just articulated something she'd been struggling to understand herself. This wasn't really about the building or the tenants or even David's intentions. This was about whether she had the right to make decisions about her own life, even when those decisions went against her family's wishes. 20 minutes later, Lisa arrived, her expression tense but determined. The three of them sat around Clara's kitchen table, 3 generations of Thompsons who had finally aligned against the fourth. David's planning to file emergency guardianship papers tomorrow, Lisa said without preamble. His lawyer thinks the APS investigation was flawed because Santos didn't understand the complexity of the financial arrangements. Kevin's jaw tightened. So he's going to court to argue that Mom's too smart for her own good? Essentially, yes. He's going to claim that anyone competent enough to create a tenant protection trust is also competent enough to be manipulated into creating one against her own interests. Clara felt the walls closing in. David had found a way to turn her competency into evidence of incompetency. Her strategic thinking would be reframed as proof that she'd been manipulated by Elena. There's more, Lisa continued. He's hired a private investigator to look into Elena's background and her other clients. He's building a case that she targets vulnerable elderly property owners. The three of them sat in silence, absorbing the implications. David wasn't just escalating, he was preparing for total war. The emergency family meeting David called for Sunday morning took place in the sterile conference room of his Palo Alto law firm. Clara sat between Kevin and Lisa, facing her eldest son across a polished mahogany table that reflected the fluorescent lights like a mirror of judgment. David had brought reinforcements: his attorney, James Morrison, and the private investigator. He'd hired a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Chen, who carried herself with the cold efficiency of someone accustomed to uncovering uncomfortable truths. Before we begin, David said, his voice carrying none of its usual warmth, I want everyone to understand what we're dealing with here. He slid a manila folder across the table. Patricia's investigation into Elena Vasquez reveals some very interesting patterns. Clara felt Kevin tense beside her, but she forced herself to remain calm as Lisa opened the folder. Inside were photographs of Elena meeting with other elderly clients, property records showing similar tenant protection trusts established for other buildings, and what appeared to be financial records showing Elena's income from these cases. Elena Vasquez has created identical trust structures for 17 different property owners in the past 3 years, Patricia Chen reported in a flat, professional tone. All elderly, all owners of rent-controlled buildings in gentrifying neighborhoods. The pattern suggests a systematic approach to preventing property redevelopment, which means, David added, his eyes fixed on Clara, that our mother hasn't been making independent decisions about her property. She's been recruited into a larger campaign that uses elderly property owners as fronts for housing activism. Clara felt the trap closing around her. David's narrative was seductive in its simplicity, the confused elderly woman manipulated by an ideological lawyer who exploited her vulnerability for political purposes. That's not, Kevin began, but Clara placed a restraining hand on his arm. Let me respond, she said quietly. David, you're absolutely right that Elena has helped other property owners protect their tenants. What you're wrong about is my role in that process. She reached into her own folder and produced a document that made David's eyes widen. This is my initial consultation request with Elena, dated 6 months ago, in my own handwriting. along with my research notes on tenant protection law, housing displacement statistics, and gentrification patterns in our neighborhood. Lisa leaned forward to examine the documents. Mom, this is incredibly detailed research. Because I'm not a victim of Elena's activism, Clara said firmly. I'm a participant in it. I sought her out after I realized what David was planning for the building. David's composure cracked slightly. You researched tenant protection law? I have a master's degree in urban planning, David. I may be 78, but I haven't forgotten how to read legal documents or analyze housing policy. The silence that followed was profound. Clara watched her son grapple with the collision between his assumptions about her capabilities and the evidence of her actual competency. James Morrison, David's attorney, cleared his throat. Mrs. Thompson, even if you initiated contact with Ms. Vasquez, that doesn't address the question of whether creating this trust was in your best financial interests. My best financial interests? Clara repeated slowly. According to whom? According to any objective analysis, David said, recovering his composure. You're sitting on a property worth over $3 million, generating maybe $60,000 a year in rental income. Market rate units would triple that income. And displace 9 families in the process. That's not your responsibility. Clara stood up, her chair scraping against the polished floor. David, let me be very clear about something. I didn't create the Tenant Protection Trust because I was confused or manipulated. I created it because displacing my tenants for profit would be morally wrong. Morally wrong? David's voice rose. Mom, these people are taking advantage of your generosity. They're paying below market rent while you struggle to maintain the building. I'm not struggling, Clara said calmly. The building is profitable at current rent levels. It's just not maximally profitable. Kevin had been quiet throughout this exchange, but now he spoke up. David, you keep talking about Mom's best interests as if they're purely financial. What if her best interests include maintaining relationships with people she cares about? What if her best interests include being able to look at herself in the mirror? This isn't about sentiment, Kevin. This is about reality. Whose reality? Lisa interjected. Because from where I sit, Mom has made a deliberate, well-researched decision about her own property based on her own values. The fact that you disagree with those values doesn't make her incompetent. David's attorney leaned forward. Mr. Thompson, perhaps we should discuss the guardianship petition privately. No, David said firmly. We're past that point. He turned to face Clara directly. Mom, I'm filing emergency guardianship papers tomorrow. I'm going to argue that your decision-making has been compromised by outside influence and that you need court-supervised protection. The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Clara felt the weight of what this meant. Her eldest son was prepared to have her declared legally incompetent, rather than accept that she disagreed with his vision for her life. David, she said quietly, if you do this, there's no going back. You'll be telling a court that your own mother is too confused to manage her own affairs. Are you prepared for the consequences of that? What consequences? Clara pulled out her phone and showed him a text message. Elena's firm has been retained by the San Francisco Tenants Union. If you file for guardianship, they're going to file a counter-petition alleging elder abuse disguised as family intervention. David's face went pale. You're threatening me? I'm informing you, just like you informed me about your investigation and your legal plans. Clara's voice carried a steel that none of her children had heard before. You want to make this a public legal battle? Fine, but understand that Elena has documented everything. Your attempts to pressure me into selling, your dismissal of my clearly stated wishes, your refusal to accept that I might be competent enough to disagree with you. Patricia Chen spoke up for the first time since presenting her report. Mr. Thompson, there's something else you should know. The tenant protection trust your mother created, it's ironclad. Even if you win guardianship, You won't be able to break it without proving fraud or duress. And given Mrs. Thompson's documented research and Elena Vasquez's reputation, that would be extremely difficult to establish. The meeting dissolved into chaos as David realized the full scope of what Clara had accomplished. She hadn't just protected her tenants, she'd maneuvered him into a position where his only options were to accept her decision or engage in a public legal battle he was unlikely to win. As the Thompson family left the law office, they had effectively split into two camps. David, isolated but determined, prepared to escalate the conflict to its ultimate conclusion. Clara, Kevin, and Lisa united in their opposition to his authoritarian approach to family problem-solving. But as they walked to their cars, Clara realized that winning this battle might cost her something she'd never intended to sacrifice: her relationship with her eldest son. David's pride wouldn't let him back down now, and Clara's principles wouldn't let her give in. The final confrontation was inevitable. The only question was whether anything of their family would survive it. That evening, as Clara sat in her apartment overlooking the building she'd fought so hard to protect, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Elena's number. "Clara, we have a problem. David's legal team just filed for an emergency hearing, tomorrow morning. They're claiming you're in immediate danger of financial exploitation." Clara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 40 years of building this community, 5 years of managing alone since Harold's death, and 6 months of careful planning, all converging on a single moment in a courtroom. "Then we'd better be ready," she said. The emergency family meeting David called for Sunday morning took place in the sterile conference room of his Palo Alto law firm. Clara sat between Kevin and Lisa, facing her eldest son across a polished mahogany table that reflected the fluorescent lights like a mirror of judgment. David had brought reinforcements: his attorney, James Morrison, and the private investigator he'd hired, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Chen, who carried herself with the cold efficiency of someone accustomed to uncovering uncomfortable truths. "Before we begin," David said, his voice carrying none of its usual warmth, "I want everyone to understand what we're dealing with here." He slid a manila folder across the table. Patricia's investigation into Elena Vasquez reveals some very interesting patterns. Clara felt Kevin tense beside her, but she forced herself to remain calm as Lisa opened the folder. Inside were photographs of Elena meeting with other elderly clients, property records showing similar tenant protection trusts established for other buildings, and what appeared to be financial records showing Elena's income from these cases. Elena Vasquez has created identical trust structures for 17 different property owners in the past 3 years, Patricia Chen reported in a flat, professional tone. All elderly, all owners of rent-controlled buildings in gentrifying neighborhoods. The pattern suggests a systematic approach to preventing property redevelopment. Which means, David added, his eyes fixed on Clara, that our mother hasn't been making independent decisions about her property. She's been recruited into a larger campaign that uses elderly property owners as fronts for housing activism. Clara felt the trap closing around her. David's narrative was seductive in its simplicity. The confused elderly woman manipulated by an ideological lawyer who exploited her vulnerability for political purposes. "That's not," Kevin began, but Clara placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Let me respond," she said quietly. "David, you're absolutely right that Elena has helped other property owners protect their tenants. What you're wrong about is my role in that process." She reached into her own folder and produced a document that made David's eyes widen. "This is my initial consultation request with Elena, dated 6 months ago, in my own handwriting, along with my research notes on tenant protection law, housing displacement statistics, and gentrification patterns in our neighborhood." Lisa leaned forward to examine the documents. "Mom, this is incredibly detailed research." "Because I'm not a victim of Elena's activism," Clara said firmly. "I'm a participant in it. I sought her out after I realized what David was planning for the building. David's composure cracked slightly. You researched tenant protection law? I have a master's degree in urban planning, David. I may be 78, but I haven't forgotten how to read legal documents or analyze housing policy. The silence that followed was profound. Clara watched her son grapple with the collision between his assumptions about her capabilities and the evidence of her actual competency. James Morrison, David's attorney, cleared his throat. Mrs. Thompson, even if you initiated contact with Ms. Vasquez, that doesn't address the question of whether creating this trust was in your best financial interests. My best financial interests, Clara repeated slowly. According to whom? According to any objective analysis, David said, recovering his composure. You're sitting on a property worth over $3 million, generating maybe $60,000 a year in rental income. Market rate units would triple that income and displace 9 families in the process. That's not your responsibility. Clara stood up, her chair scraping against the polished floor. David, let me be very clear about something. I didn't create the Tenant Protection Trust because I was confused or manipulated. I created it because displacing my tenants for profit would be morally wrong. Morally wrong? David's voice rose. Mom, these people are taking advantage of your generosity. They're paying below market rent while you struggle to maintain the building. I'm not struggling, Clara said calmly. The building is profitable at current rent levels. It's just not maximally profitable. Kevin had been quiet throughout this exchange, but now he spoke up. David, you keep talking about Mom's best interests as if they're purely financial. What if her best interests include maintaining relationships with people she cares about? What if her best interests include being able to look at herself in the mirror? This isn't about sentiment, Kevin. This is about reality. Whose reality? Lisa interjected. Because from where I sit, Mom has made a deliberate, well-researched decision about her own property based on her own values. The fact that you disagree with those values doesn't make her incompetent. David's attorney leaned forward. Mr. Thompson, perhaps we should discuss the guardianship petition privately. No, David said firmly. We're past that point. He turned to face Clara directly. Mom, I'm filing emergency guardianship papers tomorrow. I'm going to argue that your decision-making has been compromised by outside influence and that you need court-supervised protection. The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Clara felt the weight of what this meant. Her eldest son was prepared to have her declared legally incompetent, rather than accept that she disagreed with his vision for her life. David, she said quietly, if you do this, there's no going back. You'll be telling a court that your own mother is too confused to manage her own affairs. Are you prepared for the consequences of that? What consequences? Clara pulled out her phone and showed him a text message. Elena's firm has been retained by the San Francisco Tenants Union. If you file for guardianship, they're going to file a counter-petition alleging elder abuse disguised as family intervention. David's face went pale. You're threatening me? I'm informing you, just like you informed me about your investigation and your legal plans. Clara's voice carried a steel that none of her children had heard before. You want to make this a public legal battle? Fine, but understand that Elena has documented everything. Your attempts to pressure me into selling, your dismissal of my clearly stated wishes, your refusal to accept that I might be competent enough to disagree with you. Patricia Chen spoke, up for the first time since presenting her report. Mr. Thompson, there's something else you should know. The Tenant Protection Trust your mother created, it's ironclad. Even if you win guardianship, you won't be able to break it without proving fraud or duress. And given Mrs. Thompson's documented research and Elena Vasquez's reputation, that would be extremely difficult to establish. The meeting dissolved into chaos as David realized the full scope of what Clara had accomplished. She hadn't just protected her tenants. She'd maneuvered him into a position where his only options were to accept her decision or engage in a public legal battle he was unlikely to win. As the Thompson family left the law office, they had effectively split into two camps. David, isolated but determined, prepared to escalate the conflict to its ultimate conclusion. Clara, Kevin, and Lisa united in their opposition to his authoritarian approach to family problem-solving. But as they walked to their cars, Clara realized that winning this battle might cost her something she'd never intended to sacrifice: her relationship with her eldest son. David's pride wouldn't let him back down now, and Clara's principles wouldn't let her give in. The final confrontation was inevitable. The only question was whether anything of their family would survive it. That evening, as Clara sat in her apartment overlooking the building she'd fought so hard to protect, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Elena's number. "Clara, we have a problem. David's legal team just filed for an emergency hearing, tomorrow morning. They're claiming you're in immediate danger of financial exploitation." Clara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 40 years of building this community, 5 years of managing alone since Harold's death, and 6 months of careful planning, all converging on a single moment in a courtroom. "Then we'd better be ready," she said. The court-ordered family counseling session took place 3 days after Judge Wong's ruling, in a sterile office in downtown San Francisco, where Dr. Sarah Martinez specialized in elder family dynamics. Clara arrived early, sitting in the waiting room and watching David pace outside through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Even in defeat, her eldest son carried himself with the rigid posture of someone who refused to acknowledge that his fundamental assumptions about the world had been shattered. When Kevin and Lisa arrived together, the family assembled in Dr. Martinez's office felt more like adversaries meeting for treaty negotiations than relatives seeking reconciliation. David sat across from Clara, his jaw set in the stubborn line she remembered from his childhood, the expression he wore when he believed the entire world was wrong except for him. "Before we begin," Dr. Martinez said, her voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone accustomed to mediating family conflicts, "I want to establish that this isn't about who was right or wrong in the legal proceeding. This is about understanding how your family relationships reached this point and what you can do to move forward." David spoke first, his words carefully controlled but edged with barely contained anger. "I spent 6 months watching my mother exhibit signs of confusion and declining capacity. I arranged professional help, legal protection, and care options. In response, she spent those same 6 months deliberately deceiving me while undermining everything I was trying to do to help her." "David," Dr. Martinez said gently, "when you say help her, what specifically did you mean?" "I meant protecting her from making decisions that would leave her financially vulnerable and emotionally isolated." "And who determined that her decisions would have those consequences?" The question hung in the air. David's mouth opened and closed, as if he was about to provide an obvious answer that suddenly seemed less obvious. Clara watched her son grapple with a concept that had never occurred to him, that his assessment of what constituted good decisions for her might not be universally correct. "David," Clara said quietly, "you never asked me what I wanted. You observed what you thought were problems and decided to solve them without ever consulting me about whether I agreed they were problems that needed solving." "Of course they were problems." David's composure cracked. "Mom, you were living in a deteriorating building, managing tenants who were taking advantage of your generosity, dealing with maintenance issues that were bleeding money." "According to whom?" Lisa interrupted. "David, I visit Mom regularly. I never saw a deteriorating building. I saw an older building with character that was well-maintained and filled with people who genuinely cared about each other." Kevin leaned forward. "David, you keep talking about the building like it's a business asset that's underperforming, but Mom and Dad didn't buy it as an investment property. They bought it as a home that could also provide homes for other people. That's not financially sustainable in the long term." "Why not?" Clara asked. The building generates enough income to cover its expenses and provide me with adequate income for my needs. The only way it's not sustainable is if you measure sustainability purely by whether it's generating maximum possible profit. Dr. Martinez made notes as she watched the family dynamic unfold. David, can you help me understand what made you assume that your mother's decisions were the result of diminished capacity rather than different values? David was quiet for a long moment, his corporate training warring with the uncomfortable reality of examining his own assumptions. She was forgetting things, having trouble with paperwork, seeming confused about financial matters. Was she actually forgetting things? Dr. Martinez asked. Or was she prioritizing things you didn't think were important? Clara felt a stab of guilt as she watched David confront the possibility that every sign of confusion he'd interpreted as evidence of decline had actually been evidence of her deliberately misleading him. David, she said, I need you to understand something. I didn't start performing confusion because I wanted to deceive you. I started doing it because every time I expressed an opinion you disagreed with, you attributed it to my age rather than my judgment. That's not, David began, then stopped. Clara watched him remember specific conversations where he had indeed dismissed her concerns about tenant displacement by suggesting she was becoming overly sentimental in her old age. You decided I was incompetent the moment I disagreed with your plans for the building, Clara continued. So I let you believe I was incompetent while I protected what mattered to me. Lisa spoke up, her voice carrying the authority of her professional experience. David, what Mom is describing is a pattern I see constantly in my work. Adult children who love their elderly parents but assume that any decision that seems irrational to them must be evidence of cognitive decline. But some elderly people do experience cognitive decline, David protested. Some elderly people are vulnerable to exploitation. Yes, Dr. Martinez agreed, but some elderly people are also capable of making autonomous decisions that their adult children disagree with. The challenge is learning to distinguish between the two. Kevin had been unusually quiet throughout this exchange, but now he spoke with the measured tone of someone who had spent considerable time thinking about what he wanted to say. David, can I ask you something? When you were planning Mom's intervention, when you were researching guardianship options, when you hired that private investigator, did you ever consider the possibility that you might be wrong about her competency? David's silence was answer enough. Because from where I sit, Kevin continued, it looks like you built an entire case for Mom's incompetency without ever seriously considering that she might be competent enough to disagree with you. Dr. Martinez turned to Clara. Mrs. Thompson, how has this conflict affected your feelings about your relationship with David? Clara felt tears threaten for the first time since this ordeal began. I love my son. I always have. But David, I need you to understand that your version of caring, for me, felt like imprisonment. You wanted to make my decisions for me because you didn't trust my judgment. That's not care. That's control. I was trying to protect you, David said, his voice smaller now, stripped of its earlier certainty. From what? From making choices you wouldn't make? From prioritizing community over profit? From aging in my own home with people I care about? David was quiet for several minutes, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability Clara hadn't heard since he was a child. I was trying to protect you from being taken advantage of, from being left alone and struggling, from... He paused, struggling with words. From what happened to Dad? Clara felt her heart break a little. Harold's decline had been gradual but devastating, a proud man reduced to confusion and dependency that robbed him of his dignity in his final months. David had watched his father become a shadow of himself, and Clara suddenly understood that her son's aggressive intervention wasn't just about control, it was about terror. David, she said gently, I'm not Dad. And even if I were developing cognitive issues, that wouldn't give you the right to make my decisions for me without my consent. But what if you couldn't make good decisions anymore? What if you needed protection? Lisa answered before Clara could. Then we would have that conversation with her, not about her. We would involve her in planning for that possibility instead of planning around her. Dr. Martinez looked around the room. What I'm hearing is that this conflict arose because David was trying to solve problems he perceived without consulting the person most affected by those problems. Clara responded by protecting herself in the only way she felt was available to her. The result was a breakdown in trust that culminated in a legal battle. She turned to David. David, are you able to acknowledge that your mother might be competent to make decisions you disagree with? David struggled with the question, his entire worldview shifting. I don't know how to separate caring about someone from trying to solve their problems. That, Dr. Martinez said, is exactly what we need to work on. As the session ended, Clara realized that while the legal battle was over, the work of rebuilding their family relationships was just beginning. David would need to learn to respect her autonomy even when he disagreed with her choices. She would need to learn to trust him with her real thoughts and feelings instead of hiding behind performances of helplessness. But for the first time since this conflict began, Clara felt hope that her family might survive the wreckage of their assumptions about each other. Walking out of the building together, David fell into step beside her. "Mom," he said quietly, "I need you to know that everything I did because I love you." "I know," Clara replied, "and I need you to know that everything I did because I love the life your father and I built together, including the parts you wanted me to give up." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of understanding. And for now, that was enough. 3 weeks after the family therapy session, Clara found herself back in Judge Wong's courtroom for the final hearing that would officially close David's guardianship petition. But this time, the atmosphere was entirely different. Instead of the tense confrontation that had marked their first appearance, the courtroom buzzed with the energy of community celebration. The gallery was packed not just with tenant advocates, but with residents from Clara's building and neighboring properties. Mr. Park sat in his usual front row seat, wearing his Korean War veteran cap and a small smile. Rosa Martinez held Carmen's hand, the 6-year-old having insisted on coming to see Grandma Clara win in court. Marcus Webb, the building's newest tenant, had taken time off work to attend, understanding that this case would set a precedent for tenant protection throughout the city. Elena sat beside Clara at the defendant's table, a thick folder of additional documentation in front of her. Over the past 3 weeks, their case had attracted attention from housing rights organizations throughout California, with several filing amicus briefs supporting Clara's right to prioritize community over profit. David sat with his attorney, but his posture had changed dramatically since their last court appearance. Gone was the rigid certainty of someone convinced of his righteous cause. Instead, he carried the weary resignation of someone who had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about his own motivations and assumptions. Judge Wong entered precisely at 10 a.m., her expression serious but carrying a hint of satisfaction that suggested she had prepared remarks that went beyond the standard legal formalities. "We're here today to formally close the guardianship petition filed by David Thompson," Judge Wong began. "But this case has raised issues that extend far beyond the immediate family dynamics involved." She turned to address David directly. "Mr. Thompson, when you filed this petition, you argued that your mother's decision to create a tenant protection trust was evidence of diminished capacity or manipulation. The court has thoroughly reviewed all evidence and testimony, and I want to be absolutely clear about our findings." Clara felt Elena tense beside her as Judge Wong paused, consulting her notes. Mrs. Clara Thompson demonstrated not only complete mental competency, but sophisticated understanding of housing law, urban planning principles, and the socioeconomic factors affecting her community. Her decision to prioritize long-term community stability over short-term financial gain represents exactly the kind of informed, values-based decision-making that our legal system is designed to protect. A murmur of approval rippled through the gallery, quickly silenced by the bailiff. Judge Wong continued, her voice gaining strength. More concerning to this court is the pattern of assumptions that led to this petition being filed in the first place. Mr. Thompson, your mother's decision to disagree with your assessment of her best interests is not evidence of incompetency. It's evidence of autonomy. Clara watched David's face as Judge Wong delivered what amounted to a public lecture on elder rights and family dynamics. This court sees too many cases where adult children confuse their own anxiety about aging with actual evidence of their parents' incapacity. Mrs. Thompson's strategic thinking, careful planning, and successful execution of a complex legal protection scheme demonstrates cognitive abilities that many people half her age would envy. Judge Wong then turned to address the broader implications of the case. The Tenant Protection Trust created by Mrs. Thompson represents an innovative approach to addressing housing displacement in our city. Rather than viewing this as evidence of exploitation, this court recognizes it as evidence of creative problem-solving by someone who understands both her legal rights and her moral obligations to her community. Elena leaned forward as Judge Wong addressed the legal precedent being established. Therefore, this court not only denies the guardianship petition, but establishes the following findings. First, elderly property owners have the absolute right to make decisions about their property based on values other than profit maximization. Second, family disagreement with those decisions does not constitute grounds for competency challenges. Third, the creation of tenant protection mechanisms represents legitimate exercise of property rights that should be supported, not undermined, by our legal system. The courtroom erupted in applause before the bailiff could restore order. Clara felt tears streaming down her face as she realized that her personal battle had become a broader statement about elder rights and housing justice. But Judge Wong wasn't finished. However, this court is also deeply concerned about the family relationships that have been damaged by this conflict. Therefore, I am ordering continued family counseling for all parties and establishing a support structure to ensure that Mrs. Thompson's independence is maintained, while also preserving family connections. She looked directly at David. Mr. Thompson, your love for your mother is evident, but love expressed through control is not love, it's possession. You have an opportunity to learn how to support your mother's autonomy instead of undermining it. As Judge Wong concluded the formal proceedings, Clara stood to address the court, something she hadn't been expected to do but felt compelled to say. Your Honor, if I may, Clara began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. This case has been portrayed as a victory for tenant rights and elder autonomy, and those things are important. But I want to say something about what this has cost. She turned to look at David, who was staring at his hands. My son David acted out of love and fear that I would be hurt or taken advantage of. Those are not evil motivations. But love that denies autonomy and fear that justifies control can cause as much harm as neglect or abuse. The courtroom had gone completely silent. I hope that other families facing similar situations will learn from our experience. Love means trusting people to make their own choices, even when those choices seem wrong to you. Care means supporting someone's decisions, not making decisions for them. Clara paused, gathering courage for what she needed to say next. David, I forgive you for trying to control my life, because I understand you were trying to protect it. But I need you to understand that protection that comes at the cost of autonomy isn't protection, it's imprisonment. After the hearing, the celebration spilled out onto the courthouse steps. Local media had gathered to cover what was being described as a landmark case for elder rights and tenant protection. Clara found herself giving interviews about the broader implications of her legal strategy, But her attention kept drifting to David, who stood apart from the crowd, clearly struggling with the public nature of his very personal defeat. Kevin and Lisa flanked Clara as she spoke to reporters, but she noticed that neither of them had approached David since the hearing ended. Elena appeared at Clara's elbow as the media interviews concluded. Clara, housing advocacy groups throughout the state are asking if you'd be willing to speak about your experience. This case has the potential to inspire similar tenant protection efforts in other cities. Clara nodded, understanding that her personal battle had become something larger than she had anticipated. But as she watched David finally approach her, walking through the crowd of supporters and advocates with obvious reluctance, she realized that the most important work still lay ahead. "Mom," David said quietly when he reached her, "can we talk privately?" As they walked away from the celebration, Clara understood that the real test of whether her victory was meaningful would be measured not in legal precedents or media coverage, but in whether she and David could find a way to rebuild their relationship on foundations of mutual respect, rather than assumptions about authority and control. The court had vindicated her competency and validated her choices. Now came the harder work of learning to be a family again. 6 months after Judge Wong's final ruling, Clara stood in the courtyard of her building, watching Carmen Martinez practice violin, while Mr. Park offered gentle corrections from his folding chair. The November afternoon light filtered through, the fog rolling in from the bay, casting everything in the soft glow that made San Francisco feel like a city suspended between dreams and reality. The building had indeed become something of a model, just as Judge Wong had predicted. Housing advocates from Sacramento, Los Angeles, and even Seattle had made pilgrimages to study the tenant protection trust that Elena had crafted. Clara found herself fielding calls from elderly property owners facing similar family pressures, offering guidance on how to protect both their autonomy and their communities. "Mrs. Thompson?" A young woman with a notebook approached from the building's entrance. "I'm Sarah Kim from the San Francisco Chronicle. I'm doing a follow-up story on your case for our housing series. Do you have a few minutes?" Clara had grown accustomed to media attention over the past months, though she still found it strange to be considered a newsworthy figure at 78. "Of course, but let's sit inside. Carmen's practicing for her recital next week, and I don't want to disturb her." In her apartment, Clara offered tea while Sarah set up her recorder. The space had changed subtly since David's first intervention. The carefully arranged chaos of confusion was gone, replaced by the organized efficiency of someone who no longer needed to perform helplessness. 6 months ago, you were facing a guardianship petition from your own son, Sarah began. "How do you feel about how everything turned out?" Clara considered the question carefully. Vindicated, but not entirely satisfied. Winning a legal battle and healing a family are two very different accomplishments. "How are things with David now?" "Better, but still fragile." Clara's voice carried the weight of ongoing complexity. "We've been in family therapy every week since the court ordered it. David is learning to separate his anxiety about my safety from his desire to control my decisions. I'm learning to trust him with my real thoughts instead of hiding behind performances of confusion." It was true, though the progress had been painful and incremental. David still struggled with accepting decisions he viewed as financially suboptimal, but he had stopped interpreting those decisions as evidence of incompetency. More importantly, he had begun asking about her reasoning instead of assuming her motivations. "What about the building itself? Has the tenant protection trust worked as intended?" Clara smiled, gesturing toward the window where Carmen's violin. Practice continued. "Better than intended, actually. When word spread that our tenants had permanent protection from displacement, we started attracting applications from families who had been priced out of other neighborhoods. Rosa graduated from nursing school last month and got a job at UCSF. Mr. Park has started a community garden on the roof. Marcus organized a tool library in the basement." The building had become what Clara and Harold had always envisioned, not just affordable housing, but genuine community. The security provided by the trust had allowed tenants to invest in improvements and relationships that they might not have risked in less stable housing situations. Sarah consulted her notes. Your case has inspired similar efforts in other cities. How do you feel about becoming, essentially, a poster case for elder rights and tenant protection? Honored, but also aware of the responsibility that comes with it. Clara paused, choosing her words carefully. I receive calls almost daily from elderly property owners whose adult children are pressuring them to sell or convert their buildings. What I've learned is that my situation wasn't unique. Family members using the guise of care to justify control happens more often than most people realize. Indeed, Elena's law firm had been retained by 12 other elderly property owners in similar situations over the past 6 months. The legal strategy Clara had pioneered was being replicated throughout the Bay Area, creating a network of protected affordable housing that developers couldn't easily dismantle. A knock at the door interrupted the interview. Kevin stood in the hallway, his messenger bag slung over his shoulder and a folder of papers in his hand. Sorry to interrupt, Mom. I just finished the documentation for the graduate project. Thought you might want to see it before I submit it. Kevin's thesis had evolved into a comprehensive case study of the Thompson family conflict, examining how gentrification pressures create intergenerational tensions within families while exploring innovative legal mechanisms for community protection. His academic advisor had suggested submitting it for publication in urban planning journals. Kevin, this is Sarah Kim from the Chronicle. Sarah, this is my youngest son, Kevin. Sarah immediately perked up with journalistic interest. Kevin, you supported your mother's position from the beginning. What was it like watching your family go through this conflict? Kevin settled into Harold's old chair, his expression thoughtful. Difficult, but also educational. I realized that what looked like a simple family disagreement was actually a microcosm of larger social conflicts about aging, autonomy, and community responsibility. He opened his thesis folder, showing charts and graphs that mapped displacement patterns throughout the Mission District. What my mother accomplished wasn't just about protecting her specific tenants. She demonstrated that individual property owners can resist gentrification pressures through strategic legal planning. Clara felt pride watching Kevin articulate the broader implications of their family crisis. Of all her children, he had most clearly understood that her fight was about values, not just legal rights. After Sarah left, Clara and Kevin walked through the building together, making their weekly rounds to check on tenants and address any maintenance concerns. This ritual had evolved naturally after the court case, a way for Clara to maintain her role as an engaged landlord while also demonstrating to any future skeptics that she remained fully capable of managing her property. In apartment 2B, they found Rosa preparing dinner while Carmen practiced piano. The 6-year-old's improvement over the past months had been remarkable, but more important was the confidence that came from knowing her home was secure. Mrs. Thompson, Carmen exclaimed, abandoning her piano bench to hug Clara's legs. Listen to what I learned today. She launched into a simplified version of a Chopin nocturne, her small fingers navigating the keys with increasing assurance. Clara watched Rosa's face as her daughter played, seeing the profound relief of a mother who no longer worried about sudden displacement disrupting her child's development. Beautiful, sweetheart, Clara said when Carmen finished. Your recital is going to be wonderful. As they continued their rounds, Kevin asked the question Clara had been expecting for weeks. Mom, have you thought about what happens when you actually do need more support? When the day comes that you can't manage the building independently? It was a fair question, one that the family therapy sessions had helped them address constructively, rather than defensively. Elena helped me draft contingency plans, Clara explained. If I become unable to manage the building, ownership transfers to a community land trust controlled by the tenants themselves. They'll have the legal authority to hire professional management while maintaining the affordability protections. Kevin nodded approvingly. So you've planned for aging in place while also planning for the possibility that aging in place might not always be feasible. Exactly. David was right that I needed to plan for potential incapacity. He was wrong. That such planning required giving up my current autonomy. Their conversation was interrupted by Clara's phone ringing. The caller ID showed David's name, their weekly check-in call that had become part of the court-ordered reconciliation process. "Hi, David," Clara answered, watching Kevin's expression carefully. The relationship between her sons remained strained, though they were slowly learning to occupy the same family space without constant conflict. "Mom, I wanted to let you know that I've been thinking about our conversation last week." David's voice carried through the phone with less tension than it had in months. "About finding ways to support what you're doing instead of fighting it." Clara felt a flutter of hope. "What did you have in mind?" "Well, I've been researching community development finance. There are ways to create sustainable funding streams for affordable housing that don't depend on individual property owners carrying all the financial burden." It was the first time since the conflict began that David had approached her building as a problem to be solved rather than a problem to be eliminated. "I'd like to discuss some ideas with you and Elena, if you're interested. Ways to strengthen the financial foundation of what you've built without compromising the tenant protections." After the call ended, Kevin looked at Clara with surprise. That sounded almost like David offering to help instead of demanding to take over. "Progress," Clara said simply. "Not forgiveness yet, and certainly not forgetfulness, but progress." As the sun set over the Mission District, Clara stood on her fire escape looking out over the neighborhood that had changed so dramatically around her building. Construction cranes dotted the skyline, evidence of the development pressures that continued to reshape the city. But here, in this small corner of the Mission, 9 families slept securely in homes that couldn't be taken from them for profit. The cost had been higher than Clara had anticipated. Months of family conflict, legal battles, and the ongoing work of rebuilding trust with David. But the outcome had been more significant than she had dared hope. Her personal fight for autonomy had become a model for elder rights. Her protection of individual tenants had become a template for community preservation. Most importantly, she had learned that love and control were not synonymous, that caring for someone meant respecting their choices, even when those choices seemed wrong, and that family healing was possible even after trust had been shattered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, other elderly property owners seeking guidance, ongoing family therapy sessions, and the constant work of maintaining community in a city that often seemed hostile to such efforts. But tonight, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The satisfaction of having fought for what mattered and won not just the battle, but the possibility of lasting change. At 78, she had discovered that the most important victories were not about defeating opponents, but about creating foundations strong enough to support the communities and relationships that made life meaningful. The inheritance she would leave her children would not be measured in property values or financial portfolios, but in the example of someone who chose community over profit, principle over convenience, and love over control. It was, Clara thought as she prepared for bed, exactly the legacy Harold would have been proud of. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.